Dundee is on the rise, a city reinventing itself for the 21st century.
To explore how the city has been shaped by a history of strength and suffering, I'll be uncovering the story of an almost forgotten tragedy played out in Dundee in the depths of civil war. Shrouded in centuries of myth and mystery, it was a brutal assault and valiant resistance, known as the 1651 Siege of Dundee.
In 1651, Scotland was a nation at war. The year before, its enemy, the English Commonwealth, had crushed the Scottish army at Dunbar, paving the way for the surrender of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling and Perth. With the entirety of southern Scotland now under control of the enemy, the country's parliament, its elites and remaining soldiers had retreated to Dundee. With the nation's power brokers now sheltering within its walls, the town had become the epicentre of Scottish resistance.
But why was Scotland being invaded? And why were English armies now marching towards Dundee? Only a few years before, Scotland had been allied to the English Parliament as they struggled together against the dangerous policies of Charles I, King of England, Scotland and Ireland.
This spirit of cooperation was shattered when the English Parliament took the radical step of executing the troublemaking Charles and declaring the monarchy abolished. This was an act that horrified Scotland. Although, like England, they had fought against their king, the Scots had never imagined a world in which the monarchy wasn't still at the top of the nation's hierarchy.
Scotland's reaction? To crown the dead king's son, Charles II, as their new monarch. England, taking this as a direct threat to their very existence, saw no option but to declare war.
This new King of Scotland wasn't among those sheltering in Dundee, however. Instead, this young and charismatic Charles II was leading the remaining Scottish forces south in a desperate bid to claim his English crown. With Oliver Cromwell and much of the English army in hot pursuit, it was up to a smaller force of 6,000 men under the recently promoted Lieutenant General Monk to subjugate the rest of Scotland. Worried that the onset of winter would make fighting impossible, and eager to prove himself in his new position of authority, Monk was decisive in his early moves. His bombardment of Stirling Castle caused its terrified defenders to mutiny against their commander, forcing its quick surrender. Stripped of their weapons, the survivors wandered back to Dundee, no doubt bringing with them warnings of what was to come.
As it became apparent that Dundee would be Monk's next target, it fell to the town's military governor, Sir Robert Lumsden, to prepare the defences and to protect Dundee's inhabitants. You can see from this surviving fragment of the town wall that it wasn't built to withstand artillery assault, but as Dundee's only line of defence, it would have to do. Emergency orders were given for the women of the town to reinforce the walls with turf, while any houses just beyond it were to be torn down to deprive the English of any tactical advantage. It's clear from these measures that some Dundonians must have lost everything before the enemy had even arrived.
On the 26th of August, the English army amassed before the walls of Dundee. For the first time, Monk would have been able to assess the town and its defences. Before him was a prosperous trading port with over 10,000 inhabitants, second only to Edinburgh in size and wealth. Taking the town would be a vital step in securing the north of Scotland. For Monk, the only obstacle to total victory was Dundee and its firmly closed gates.
At this point, a siege could still be avoided. The English army had to first request the town's surrender, an offer which every town in Scotland had so far accepted. For Governor Lumsden, this was his last opportunity to weigh up his chance of success. His response? Total defiance.
We are commanded by the King's Majesty to desire you and all officers and soldiers and ships to lay down their arms, to come in and join with His Majesty's forces.
Monk was furious. How could a town surrounded by the enemy be so confident of success? To add further insult, Lumsden referred to Monk as his friend in the old manor, a sure reference to his not-so-distant past as a supporter of the Royals. With the town and its people refusing to open their gates, Monk had no choice but to set up camp and prepare his artillery for bombardment. The siege of Dundee had begun. Now cut off from the outside world, Dundee had no way of knowing that its brave resistance was fast becoming a tragic miscalculation. The first troubling sign of isolation came here at Broughty Castle, within sight of the town. A scar in the wall, carved out by a single warning shot, was all it took to cause the entire garrison here to surrender. And if walls this thick were no match for Monk's artillery, Dundee must have seemed very vulnerable indeed.
The capture of Broughty Castle was not the only military action ordered by Monk. Having gathered intelligence that the Scottish government was organising resistance to the north of Dundee, he commanded his garrison at Perth to put a decisive end to their existence. For as long as the enemy government remained at large, there would be a powerful focus for opposition in the country.
On the 28th of August, 2 days into the siege, 800 horsemen sped up to the countryside north of Dundee. It was here at Alyth, just 17 miles away from the town, that they discovered the Scottish government. Taking their enemy totally by surprise, the Republicans easily routed their troops and let themselves loose on the plunder. Almost the entirety of Scotland's political elite, including several lords, commanders and clergy, were captured in this single attack.
This humiliating collapse of the government was a major blow to Dundee's chances of success against Monk, as the town, without knowing, now had no hope of relief.
Back in Dundee, Monk's bombardment was continuing relentlessly. But it wasn't just a case of causing physical damage to the defences, there was also a psychological element as well. To breach a hole in Dundee's walls was a step towards success, but to break the morale of its citizens was a triumph that could lead to an early surrender.
The only voice we have of life in Dundee during the siege comes from Sir Robert Sibbald, who was just a child of 10 during the attack. In his account, he recalls that in the time the Englishes were storming the town, they fired cannon and muskets into the high street. My sister, a child then of 8 years of age, was exposed to their view. I ran after her to bring her back, and they fired at us in the returning. The ball missed us and battered upon the street. By the end of August, it was clear to Dundee's defenders that they wouldn't be able to hold out for much longer. Monk's assaults showed no signs of slowing down, and with their walls crumbling around them, the city's soldiers had to stay on high alert. But no matter the injuries, no matter the bombardment, Dundee was in no mood to give in. Still hoping that the government and their king would save them, the town steeled itself for the final assault. They wouldn't have to wait long. On the 1st of September, in the darkness before dawn, the now familiar sound of cannon fire opened up again over the city, with Dundee returning shots furiously. Despite inflicting casualties, the defenders were only delaying the inevitable. Shortly before noon, Monk gave the fatal order for his troops to charge. What ensued was complete panic. Monk's men broke into Dundee, charging in from both east and west to create maximum confusion. As this assault took place, Republican ships opened fire on the town from the Tay.
To push forward into the town centre, the attackers needed to fight their way through a maze of narrow streets and obstacles, where the intense, close-quarters fighting meant that swords were drawn and guns were used as clubs to bludgeon.
After what Monk called a short but sharp resistance, his men had managed to completely overwhelm Dundee.
Even then, desperate resistance continued. Seeing defeat all around, Governor Lumsden and some of his men rushed back to the steeple of St Mary's Church. This tower was the strongest structure in Dundee and became the last refuge for its royalist defenders. It was within these walls that Governor Lumsden made his final stand, firing down at the enemy below as the rest of the town was subdued. After suffering a few hours of this havoc, the Republicans eventually forced the defenders out by smoking them out by lighting fires beneath them. With the promise of protection, Lumsden at last surrendered to the victors. It was as he left, on his way to be presented to Monk as a prisoner, that an English officer took out his pistol and shot the governor dead.
Even before Lumsden had been smoked out from the steeple, the Republican army had let themselves loose on Dundee and its inhabitants.
Angered by the town's insults and wanting to reward his troops for their valiant efforts, Monk allowed his military, one of the most disciplined forces in all Europe, to mercilessly pillage Dundee for 24 hours. With the rallying cry of God with us, his men went house to house, taking anything they could get their hands on. Sir Robert Sibbald lamented, "We were all plundered, and lost in silverwork, jewellery and money, and all the furniture of the house." As the city was plunged into lawlessness, its citizens were raided, attacked and murdered as they tried to defend their families and their homes. As the attack continued, not even the town's history could be protected.
So here we are in front of the Great Charter of 1641, which was granted to the city by Charles I during all the political intrigues and the civil wars that were going on across Great Britain at the time.
Yes, in 1641, Dundee is the second borough after Edinburgh, both in political and economic wealth. So it's in interest of Charles I, with his back against the wall, to give Dundee everything she wants. So this is known as the Great Charter, and in fact it's still a legal document today. And the whole thing is filthy and not looked as though it's been looked after properly. And there is folklore that in the sack of 1651, the soldiery prized open the town's charter chest. This would have still had the great seal of Charles I on it, sitting in majesty on his throne on one side, on his horse on the other, and the Cromwellian soldiery, enraged, stuck a pike to the charter and paraded it through the town, pointing to the seal, saying that this is the face of a traitor.
So this is, by the fact that this document was taken and stuck on a pike, this is a massive insult to Dundee and
Yes.
incredibly humiliating as well.
Yes.
But the Republican army, they would have seen the seal, and this is everything that they were fighting against. What was once Scotland's second wealthiest town was now desperately poor, defaced and broken. With the figures of the dead being placed between 500 and 800 people, it's clear this was a complete disaster for the town. What's more, Monk placed his own losses at only 26 men, a figure which, if true, means that this was an incredibly one-sided fight. As brutal as the end to the siege had been, to the 17th century mind it was no atrocity. Dundee had stood defiant against the advancing English, knowing full well under the rules of war that to lose would be a death sentence. As the full day of looting drew to a close, Dundee's treasure was now firmly in the hands of its attackers. Legend says that this vast wealth was loaded up onto captured ships, which as they set out for London, were swallowed up in a freak storm, an act of God that sent all of Monk's ill-gotten gold to the bottom of the Tay. Although many have looked, this treasure remains elusive. Despite this legendary loss, Monk had every reason to be satisfied. In the space of less than a week, he had destroyed the Scottish government and ransacked a major enemy town, richly rewarding his own soldiers in the process. The scale of these victories was so great that no other town dared to rise in rebellion. In one fell swoop, Monk had effectively completed the English invasion of Scotland. With the conquest over, both Dundee and its Republican occupiers could now set about trying to establish some sense of normality. Although tradition speaks about Dundee's victims being buried callously where they fell, reality paints a far more civil outcome. In fact, Monk ordered for burials to take place across the town's graveyards, while some of his most prominent victims will later rest here in the Howth. The army's new mission in Dundee was clear. They were to convince them, if possible, of the slavery they have been under, the monarchy, and freedom they may now enjoy under the English, a republic. Despite this, animosity remained. To serve as a grim reminder of the fate that the Republic's enemies would meet, Governor Lumsden's head was hacked from his body, stuck on a spike, and placed in full view of the town from a corner of the steeple he had died defending. The English, for their part, said of the Scots that we shall not trust them further than we can see them. With Scotland defeated, it wasn't long until Charles II suffered the same fate. Only 2 days after Dundee's walls were stormed, the King's army was destroyed at the Battle of Worcester, with Charles II running away into exile on the continent. When this news arrived in Dundee, Monk's men set about cheering wildly and firing cannons, a cacophony that to Dundonians must have sounded like the city was being stormed all over again. You can't help but speculate. If Dundee had managed to hold out for a couple more days, or if Monk had been less decisive in his decision to attack, the whole tragedy of the siege could have been avoided. Although Dundee's fight for the Royalists had failed, it would not be long until their support for Charles II was vindicated. The death of Oliver Cromwell in 1659 left a power vacuum in Britain that no one could fill. Growing tired of this standstill, and with control of the army in the north, Monk marched his troops into London and demanded the return of the monarchy. Charles II arrived triumphantly in England in 1660, with Monk, as orchestrator of this restoration, being rewarded with the title Duke of Albemarle. This soldier, who had been so willing to destroy Dundee in the name of the Republic, was now catapulted into the heart of the new royalist regime. It's from this time that legends like the sunken treasure fleet are first recorded. And given Monk's political manoeuvring, it doesn't seem such a stretch to imagine him creating stories where the Republic's greed is punished, while his reputation as a ruthless commander remains intact. No matter the legends, the reality was that Dundee had been the last town in Britain to fight for the cause of the monarchy during the Civil Wars. But unlike Monk, it had received absolutely nothing from Charles II upon his return. Having found a different route to power, the king could now afford to ignore Dundee's loyalty and its sacrifice. Even without recognition, and despite the deaths and destruction, it's clear today that this was far from the end for Dundee. Throughout the 1600s, it was able to recover some of its importance. Although it would never again be Scotland's second city, its community had the spirit and the energy to overcome the challenges sent its way.